So I've been reading your work for years, and I find that it really helps shed light on the strange psychological issues that we're facing in the West today. And I say strange because over the last 50 years or so, our societies seem to be getting better at many of the things we value. We're wealthier, we're more permissive and diverse, we have more access to information, we have better technology, including in things that really matter, like medical technology. We worry a lot about giving people high self-esteem and a positive self-image. And yet, all this progress hasn't necessarily translated into better mental health. When you look at, the anxiety and depression rates, when you look at substance abuse and suicide attempts, even just generally the cultural climate with the culture wars and polarization and the news, and it's often just awful. And it's almost like something dark and unhealthy seems to have been welling up right underneath our noses as we've made all this progress on one hand. And it's hard to pin down exactly what the problem is or what the problems are, let alone how to fix them. Based on your work and research, which seems to really address this kind of paradox in the West, do you think it's true, first of all, that we're actually going through some sort of a mental health crisis? Could it just be a matter of maybe we track these things better these days, we measure them, we diagnose them more today? And if so, if we are going through a kind of a mental health crisis, from your perspective, what is it that's really driving it?
So yes, we are experiencing a mental health crisis right now, particularly among young people, so particularly among adolescents and young adults. And we know for sure it's not due to better diagnosis or people being more willing to seek help or it being more noticeable, because we've got data that goes back in time that's used exactly the same methods, and they're screening studies. They're not looking at people who seek help. They're not relying on diagnosis from a doctor or anything like that. We also have data from objectively measured behaviors, and they all show the same thing. So big increases starting usually around, at least for young people, around 2011 or 2012, in anxiety, in depression, in loneliness, in self-harm behaviors, in suicide. And they all go up right around that same time in the early 2010s. And that is the question, why? What was special about that time? Well, it wasn't the Great Recession. That was finally over by that point. When I first started to see these trends, I really had no idea what could be causing them. And then realized that that was a turning point. Among other things, the end of 2012 is when the majority of most people in Western countries had a smartphone. It's around the time that social media use among high school students moved from optional to almost mandatory. Phones got front-facing cameras, Facebook bought Instagram. Like around that period of the early 2010s, a lot of these things were changing. And it had these downstream effects too. So it wasn't just that teens and young adults are spending more time online. They were also starting to spend a lot less time with each other socializing face-to-face and a lot less time sleeping. And you put those trends together, a lot more time online, usually alone, less time with friends in person, less time sleeping. That's a terrible formula for mental health.
Definitely. So you subscribe to sort of the view that it's when the combination of the smartphone and social media together. I know Jonathan Haidt in his work really kind of zones in on specifically when Facebook and Instagram started enabling a lot of commenting features and a lot of like features, and it got people a lot more engaged. And then slowly, the algorithms starting to kind of lean towards negative emotions like outrage, like anger, because it seems to be more sticky and seems to lead to more engagement. And so that to you is really, really at least a big part of the driving force.
Yeah, I think all those things, play a role. And it's one of the reasons that I and John and others are confident that these changes in technology have something to do with the mental health crisis, is because there's so many different mechanisms. There's not just one. So it's not just the algorithms on social media, it's also the body image content leading to more appearance concern and social comparison. It's the cyberbullying, it's the algorithms, and the spending so much time on social media, and thus having less time for sleeping and less time for face-to-face interaction. Like it increases disengagement when you are with people in person, because you never know when someone's going to pull out their phone. There's all of these different mechanisms.
very complex and very impactful on people's lives. And so there's the technology piece, and there's another major theme in your work around the whole effects, let's call it, of the self-esteem movement and positivity and Generation Me and the Narcissism, which is the first two books where I got very acquainted with your work. You break down how a focus on self-esteem, which is sounds good, sounds positive, you're amazing just the way you are, everyone gets a medal, like that kind of thing, can easily become a slippery slope towards narcissism. So thinking that you're better than you actually are, or just generally being self-absorbed and self-centered. And that's kind of like a prelude to kind of going into generations, where really all of this comes together in this generational analysis that's really brilliant and super, super fascinating. But just relating to that one point of the self-esteem movement and the positive, how did we go from self-esteem, which sounds good in theory, making people feel good about themselves, into more maybe distorted forms of individualism, which seem to also be affecting our mental health today?
Yeah, and I think it started with good intentions. Perhaps with boomers who wanted to try to figure out kind of the internal life. So that was a lot of what they were exploring in the 60s and 70s. Then they had kids in the 80s, the Millennials, and they started trying to figure out self-esteem, and started to be this kind of speculation that was the key to everything. That was the key to success, and we better start making sure that kids have a high self-esteem. But it backfired because, of course, you can't teach somebody to have true, deep-seated self-confidence and self-worth. That has to come from doing things and performance and relationships, from real things. And so they went about it in this way of just basically pumping up self-esteem for no particular reason, and then expecting that to lead to good outcomes. And it didn't work. Its primary result was that you ended up with self-confidence without a basis. And then it becomes overconfidence. And then once you get to overconfidence, then sometimes it can cross over into narcissism.
It's funny. There's this the concept of like intrinsic dignity or inherent dignity of the human being, right? Which is a really good thing. Which is, I mean, every human being has intrinsic value and inherent worth. And it's funny. It's like it's almost like we have that idea. It's a great idea, but we can't stop there. We kind of have to keep growing it and growing it. And now it becomes, well, you're actually amazing and you're actually really good at it. So now it gets into competence, and competence, of course, is earned. And so if you have a growing self-worth without the merit and the competence, then you start having a delta between your theory of yourself and your actual self. And that's kind of what your work implies happened in the last couple decades or so.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation for it. Yeah, there's that gap between the view of the self and then reality, and that can be a problem.
So I find that many of the questions you raise force us to take this broader, kind of more cultural look at the different values, lifestyles, and goals that people have in different generations. And so in your latest book, Generations, you analyze the results of generational analyses spanning 24 data sets and 39 million people. So an extremely rich data set. And what I wanted to do with you, with your permission, is maybe take a quick view of each generation based on your book, and maybe have you comment on each one. But before I do, I just generally, when people talk about generations, we love just in regular pop psychology and regular parlance, we talk about different generations. There's this view that's very common, I find, where that history is just circular, that it's always the same thing, that people have always been saying these things, that, for example, like old people have always said that young people are too permissive or selfish, or they're losing the valuable things of the past. But I realized in reading your book that our sample size of generations, when we say this, is usually very, very small, right? It's usually no more than like 2, 3, maybe 4 generations. And maybe there's also linear change. In other words, it's entirely possible that across 3 or 4 successive generations, that each generation is actually getting more individualistic, actually getting more materialistic. And that seems to be a blind spot in the way people think about generations.
It definitely is, because I hear that argument a lot. Older people have always said this. Well, there's a couple problems with that argument. So one is, as you described in drawing from this big data set, virtually none of which is about what older generations are saying about younger generations. This is what people say about themselves. And that really has changed. And that has nothing to do with, older people complaining. It's just things actually have changed. People do see themselves differently. They spend their time differently. They have different views of themselves. And that is pretty different. That's a pretty different statement than saying, older people are complaining. And then the other part is exactly what you said, that this idea that, but haven't people always said that the next generation is more individualistic? Haven't they always said that they're more focused on themselves? Haven't they always said that, they're lazy or whatever the idea is? Well, with individualism at least, it is linear. Each generation actually has been more individualistic. Sometimes they put their own spin on it or their own flavor, but that idea of like, that criticism really makes no sense when you actually take it out and examine it, because it basically is saying, because somebody said something before, it has to be wrong. What? That doesn't really make any sense. And it ignores the idea that there is linear change, and that it is true that every generation is softer because our technology helps us out so much more with labor-saving devices and time-saving and everything like that. That's true. I mean, it's hard to deny that every generation gets a little further away from, say, being able to survive if dropped in the woods, unless you've done military training or something. Yeah, that's true. Every generation has gotten further away from that. Every generation has become a little bit more individualistic in one way or another. So, and I think that argument just completely ignores the possibility that change can be linear, which of course it can.
And that's why I loved your book so much, because as lawyers, we're trained to look for logical flaws and fallacies in argumentation. And it just struck me when people make that argument, well, it's always been, they never consider, it's a total blind spot, that maybe within the limited sample size of the 3 generations you're analyzing, would it not be possible that it's actually true that people got more individualistic and materialistic? And what I love with your book is that it actually proves that with data and with the actual views and all this survey evidence and so forth. And when I read it, I was like, oh, yes, like finally, the hunch is confirmed. So in generations, you describe technology as the mother turtle. So the main thing driving the change between generations, and the mother turtle has 2 daughters. And the daughters are individualism and then the slow life strategy. So the slower, having slower and slower lives, accessing adulthood later and later, and so forth. So, and this is also another hunch I've had when I read your book. I was like, okay, like this actually puts like numbers and analysis behind this hunch, is that there seems to be almost like a Tower of Babel phenomenon between generations. As technology changes our society faster and faster, it's almost like the common ground between generations is getting slimmer and slimmer. And so we speak radically different languages, and we understand each other less and less. The values are changing really, really quick. Is that something that you find as well, that the gap between generations culturally seems to be getting wider and wider as technology gets faster?
I think that's true. I think that's why, when we get to talking about the generational birth year spans, that they've gotten shorter. I don't think that's a coincidence. It's because the technological change, has sped up. I think the generation gaps now are just as big as they were between, say, the boomers and their parents, where there it was based more on individualism and values and freedom and social rules. And now a lot of it is because the generations don't even communicate using the same mediums anymore. How many baby boomers are on TikTok? Very few, and yet almost all Gen Z is. And there's been a couple of fun articles in the last couple of weeks about Gen Z slang. And you know what? Every generation of young people has their slang that tries to exclude the older generation. But it's next leveled with Gen Z. They're talking about a lot of things that they usually pick up online, and if they didn't pick it up online, then they picked it up from a friend or a peer who was online. That older generations, even millennials, right? Just a little older than them, have no idea what they're talking about. And some of that is just, slang phrases, but it's also, one example I've noticed, particularly as a Gen Xer with Gen Z kids, Gen Zers talk about gender using terms that, as of 5 years ago, a lot of people had never heard of, and a lot of Gen X parents with their Gen Z kids are like, I have no idea what you even said, because they not only have the labels and they have the shorthand for the labels, and there's a big generation gap in communication right now.
Like, what kind of labels are you talking? Is that like emojis or like symbols or like actual slang and words that are maybe coined or invented?
Just one example around gender is that there's a conceptual one, and then there's the kind of the slang part, and it's in both levels. That the concept of someone being non-binary. 10 years ago, hardly anybody had heard of that. And for Gen Z, it's just, that's Tuesday. It's something they take for granted, that a lot of older generations are like, wait, what are you even talking about? Plus, a lot of Gen Z, they don't even say non-binary. They say it's abbreviation, NB, and they pronounce it NB. And so they'll be like, oh, my friend who's NB, and like a Gen Xer will be like, what? I don't even know what that means.
Well, thank you, Gen Xer to Gen Xer. Thank you for teaching me that today, because I had no idea if I'd heard that. It's almost like this entry into this parallel universe of social media and screens almost like creates this possibility of the gap between generations. I just came back from the Mediterranean, and one of the things I like there is that people come together in person in shared spaces. So you've got either the beach or the town square, and you just naturally see people from different generations encountering each other in a physical space. And by necessity, that sort of creates the conditions for a common vocabulary, common concerns, common references. But it's like the more we virtualize, the more there's this possibility of creating these kind of silos between generations.
Yeah, it ends up very atomized. I mean, the online world is very atomized, and it does that for political views, and other types of viewpoints. You can find, no matter how crazy your idea is, you can probably find somebody that agrees with you online. That'd be a lot harder to do, in the physical world. And it's the same with generations, that we end up talking to same age peers or similar age peers much more in the online space. And, of course that happens in the physical world as well. But as you point out, there are those spaces where the generations can interact in the physical world, and there aren't as many of those online.
It's very interesting because I find your work really kind of nails the central issue that a lot of us Gen Xers saw as, we remember a world, I literally remember the summer pre-Facebook, post-Facebook, right? And then how some of our friends got caught up in the sort of rabbit holes of Facebook political arguing, and then new generations coming up. It was a very conscious change that we saw. We saw all the different layers of it. And it's this paradox of, it's a technology that was created to connect people, but then we all felt that culturally and psychologically, the effects were that it was pulling people apart. It was creating these different filter bubbles. It was creating these different communities. It was leading to people spending more time in front of screens as opposed to human interactions. And I find in your work that really becomes very clear that this kind of, the whole purpose of social media is to connect people. Zuckerberg, Facebook, I forget what the tagline literally is, like, connecting the world. But it was like psychologically and culturally seems to be doing the exact opposite.
In many ways, yeah. I mean, it's really a central irony that that's what social media was intended to do. And it can do that. It's just that what do you give up? And that's the problem. That too often, then that time goes into being on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, and then you're not spending the time in person. And that's what I found in analysis after analysis for teens and young adults, that they spend less time just hanging out with each other. They spend less time going to parties. They spend less time going to the mall. Anything that is, being with friends in person has declined by a lot in the past couple of decades.
Okay.